Margaret Henderson woke up every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., just like she had for the past 7 years. Her alarm clock didn't even need to ring anymore. Her body had become a perfectly tuned machine, programmed for one purpose: keeping Maple Ridge Estates exactly the way it should be. By 5:45, she was already dressed in her usual outfit: a crisp white polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, khaki pants pressed to perfection, and comfortable walking shoes that had seen thousands of miles of neighborhood patrols. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. She was ready for another day of maintaining order in her little corner of the world. Margaret had moved to Maple Ridge Estates 12 years ago with her husband Tom. Back then, she was just another resident trying to fit in. But Tom had passed away 5 years ago, and since then, the neighborhood had become her entire universe. Every street, every house, every blade of grass, it all mattered to her in a way that most people couldn't understand. She grabbed her morning coffee and walked to the large window in her living room that overlooked the main street of the subdivision. This was her command center, her watchtower. From here, she could see most of the neighborhood's comings and goings. The early morning joggers were already out, following the same routes they took every day. Mrs. Johnson from house number 34 was walking her little dog, making sure to carry the plastic bags like a responsible pet owner should. Everything looked normal, which was exactly how Margaret liked it. At 6 a.m. sharp, Margaret climbed into her white Honda CR-V. This wasn't just any car. This was her mobile office, her patrol vehicle. The back seat was filled with supplies that would make any security guard jealous. She had a clipboard with fresh violation forms, a camera with a powerful zoom lens, a measuring tape for checking grass height, and even a small ladder for getting better views over fences. Her first stop was always the same: the community mailbox area. This was where problems usually started. People would park incorrectly, leave their cars running while they checked mail, or worst of all, let their children run around unsupervised. Margaret parked her car at the perfect angle to observe everything while looking like she was just checking her own mail. Today she noticed that the family at house number 67 had left their garbage cans out past the pickup time again. Margaret shook her head and made a note on her clipboard. This was the third violation this month for the Peterson family. She pulled out her camera and took several photos from different angles, making sure to capture the house number clearly in each shot. As she drove slowly through the winding streets of Maple Ridge, Margaret felt a deep sense of pride. 7 years ago, when she first became HOA president, this place was starting to look rough around the edges. Grass was getting too long, people were parking boats in their driveways, and some folks were even hanging laundry outside where everyone could see it. The property values were at risk and something had to be done. That's when Margaret stepped up. She didn't ask for the job. The community needed her, and she answered the call. She remembered her first board meeting as president. There were only 3 other members then, and they seemed content to let small violations slide. It's not that big of a deal, they would say. People are busy. But Margaret knew better. She understood that small problems become big problems if you don't handle them right away. A little crack in the foundation can bring down the whole house. Within her first year, Margaret had transformed the HOA from a sleepy group that met once a month to a well-oiled machine that kept the community running smoothly. She created detailed inspection schedules, standardized violation forms, and even developed a point system for tracking repeat offenders. The other board members either got on board with her vision or found excuses to resign. Margaret pulled into the driveway of house number 89. The Williams family had been good residents for the most part, but lately she'd noticed their front lawn had some brown spots. She got out of her car and walked closer to investigate. The damage wasn't too bad yet, but it could spread if they didn't take care of it soon. She knocked on the front door and waited patiently. Mr. Williams answered, still in his bathrobe and holding a cup of coffee. He looked surprised to see her so early in the morning. "Good morning, Richard," Margaret said with a professional smile. "I was doing my routine inspection and noticed some areas of concern with your front lawn. The brown patches near your driveway are starting to spread, and according to Section 3.2 of our community guidelines, all lawns must be maintained in good condition." Richard looked confused and a little annoyed. "Margaret, it's barely 6:30 in the morning. Can't this wait until later?" "I'm afraid lawn maintenance is time-sensitive," Margaret replied, pulling out a violation notice that she had already filled out. "The longer you wait, the worse it gets. I've included some recommended treatments in your notice, along with the timeline for correction. You have 14 days to show significant improvement." After Richard closed the door, perhaps a bit more firmly than necessary, Margaret walked back to her car feeling satisfied. This was exactly the kind of proactive approach that kept Maple Ridge looking beautiful. Some people might call her pushy or demanding, but she preferred to think of herself as thorough and dedicated. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Janet, her friend who served as president of the Sunset Hills HOA across town. "Coffee later? I have stories." Margaret smiled and typed back a quick yes. Janet was one of the few people who truly understood the challenges of maintaining community standards. Their monthly coffee meetings were like strategy sessions where they shared tips and supported each other through the tough decisions. As Margaret continued her patrol, she thought about how much the neighborhood had changed since she took charge. Property values had increased by 23% over the past 7 years, well above the area average. The streets were cleaner, the lawns were greener, and everything just looked more organized. Real estate agents specifically mentioned the well-maintained community standards when they showed houses in Maple Ridge. But the job wasn't easy. Margaret had to make difficult decisions almost every day. Sometimes she had to be firm with people who didn't want to follow the rules. Sometimes she had to stand her ground when residents complained about her methods. There were even a few people who had tried to have her removed from the board, but the community always supported her in the end because they could see the results. She pulled over to check on the community playground. Everything looked good here. The equipment was clean, the mulch was fresh, and there was no litter anywhere. This was one of Margaret's proudest achievements. When she first became president, the playground was in terrible condition. She had organized fundraisers, coordinated volunteer work days, and even used some of her own money to make improvements. Margaret's phone rang as she was getting back in her car. It was the security company that monitored the community entrance gate. "Mrs. Henderson, we've got a delivery truck trying to get in, but they don't have the right authorization code. What should we do?" "What kind of delivery?" Margaret asked. "Looks like furniture for the house on Oakwood Drive." Margaret knew immediately which house they meant. That was the new resident who had just moved in last week. She hadn't had a chance to introduce herself and go over the community guidelines yet. "Let them through, but make sure they understand that all future deliveries need proper authorization 24 hours in advance," Margaret instructed. "And please get the name of the resident so I can follow up with them about our delivery procedures." This was exactly the kind of situation that Margaret was good at handling. New residents always needed guidance about how things worked in Maple Ridge. It wasn't their fault, they just didn't know the rules yet. But it was her job to make sure they learned quickly, so that everyone could continue enjoying the peaceful, well-organized community they had all worked so hard to create. As Margaret finished her morning patrol and headed home for breakfast, she felt the familiar satisfaction of a job well done. Another day was beginning in Maple Ridge Estates, and thanks to her watchful eye, it would be just as beautiful and orderly as every day before it. She had no idea that in just a few days, her perfectly controlled world was about to meet a challenge unlike anything she had faced before. Detective Ryan Torres stood in the empty living room of his new house, boxes stacked everywhere, and couldn't help but smile. After 15 years of apartment living and saving every penny he could, he finally owned his own home. The modest 3-bedroom ranch house at 1247 Oakwood Drive wasn't fancy, but it was his. Every mortgage payment would be building something for his future, instead of just paying someone else's bills. Ryan had been searching for the perfect house for almost 2 years. His job as a detective with the narcotics division meant he worked odd hours and dealt with some pretty rough situations. Coming home to a cramped apartment in the city, where sirens wailed all night and neighbors argued through thin walls, had started wearing on him. He needed somewhere quiet, somewhere he could actually relax and recharge. Maple Ridge Estates seemed perfect when his real estate agent first showed him around. The streets were clean and well-maintained. The houses all looked cared for. Kids, were riding bikes and playing in their yards. It felt like the kind of neighborhood where people actually knew each other and looked out for one another. After dealing with the worst parts of human nature at work, Ryan was ready for a place where the biggest problem might be someone's dog barking too loud. The house itself was exactly what he needed. It had a good-sized driveway where he could park his work vehicle, a small backyard where he could maybe put in a garden someday, and an extra bedroom that would be perfect for when his daughter came to stay on weekends. Ashley was 16 now and lived with her mother across town, but she'd been excited about having her own space at her dad's new place. Ryan's work vehicle was a black Ford Explorer that looked like thousands of other SUVs on the road. The police department used unmarked cars for detective work because they needed to blend in. When you're investigating drug dealers or working undercover operations, you can't exactly show up in a car with "police" written on the side. The Explorer had a few special features: better radio equipment, reinforced panels, and some other modifications, but from the outside, it just looked like any other family car. On his first morning in the new house, Ryan was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when he noticed a white Honda CR-V driving very slowly past his house. The driver seemed to be looking directly at his driveway where the Explorer was parked. Ryan didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a neighbor, being curious about the new person moving in. But then the same car came by again an hour later, going just as slowly. And again that afternoon. By the third day, Ryan started paying attention. The car would cruise by at different times of day, always slowing down when it got to his house. Sometimes it would even stop for a few seconds before moving on. Ryan had been a cop for 15 years and his instincts were pretty sharp. Something about this felt off, but he couldn't figure out what. Was someone watching him? Had his cover been blown on one of his cases? In his line of work, you made enemies, and those enemies sometimes held grudges. He found himself checking his rearview mirror more often and paying extra attention to his surroundings. The mystery was solved on his fourth morning in the house when his next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Chen, came over to introduce himself. Mr. Chen had lived in Maple Ridge for 20 years and seemed like a genuinely nice guy. They were talking about the neighborhood when Mr. Chen mentioned something that made everything click. "Oh, and you'll probably meet Margaret Henderson soon," Mr. Chen said with a slightly tired smile. "She's our HOA president. Very dedicated to keeping the neighborhood looking nice. That white Honda you've probably seen driving around, that's her doing her daily inspections." Ryan felt a mix of relief and amusement. So he wasn't being surveilled by criminals. He was being watched by the neighborhood HOA president. He'd heard stories about overzealous HOA boards from other cops who lived in suburban communities, but he'd never experienced it himself. "What kind of inspections?" Ryan asked. Mr. Chen looked around as if making sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. "She checks everything. Lawn height, paint colors, where people park their cars, what kind of decorations they put up. She's got rules for everything and she's not shy about enforcing them. Most folks just try to stay on her good side." As Mr. Chen was explaining this, the white Honda appeared again, cruising slowly down the street. This time Ryan got a good look at the driver. She was a middle-aged woman who seemed very focused on something, taking her time to observe each house as she passed. When she got to Ryan's house, she definitely slowed down and spent several seconds looking at his Explorer. "There she is now," Mr. Chen said quietly. "She's probably trying to figure out what kind of car you drive and whether it fits the community standards." Ryan watched the Honda continue down the street and felt his first twinge of concern. He'd bought this house specifically to get away from drama and conflict. The last thing he wanted was to get into some kind of dispute with a neighbor over parking rules or community regulations. That evening, Ryan called his partner Jake, who lived in a similar suburban community about 20 minutes away. Jake had been dealing with his own HOA issues for years and had plenty of advice. "Dude, you've got to be careful with these HOA people," Jake warned him. "Some of them are totally reasonable, but others, they get a little bit of power and it goes straight to their heads. They start thinking they're running their own little kingdom." "It's just a car in my own driveway," Ryan said. "What could be the problem with that?" "You'd be surprised," Jake replied. "My neighbor got cited because his work truck was supposedly too commercial looking. Another guy got in trouble for parking a rental car in his driveway when his regular car was in the shop. These people can find problems with anything if they want to. Ryan spent that night reading through the HOA documents that had come with his house purchase. The paperwork was incredibly detailed. Pages and pages of rules about everything from mailbox colors to fence heights to acceptable types of outdoor lighting. There was indeed a section about vehicles, but it was pretty vague. It mentioned that commercial vehicles weren't allowed to be parked in driveways overnight, but it didn't clearly define what counted as commercial. His Explorer definitely wasn't commercial in the usual sense. It wasn't a delivery truck or a work van with company logos. It was just a regular SUV that happened to be owned by the police department instead of a private individual. Plenty of people in the neighborhood probably drove company cars or vehicles, provided by their employers. Over the next few days, Ryan started paying more attention to the other cars in the neighborhood. He saw pickup trucks that were probably used for construction work, a couple of vans that looked like they might belong to contractors, and several cars with business decals on them. His unmarked police vehicle was actually less obviously work-related than most of these. But Margaret's Honda kept making its regular rounds, and she always seemed to spend extra time looking at his house. Ryan began to feel like he was living under a microscope. He'd come home from a long shift dealing with actual criminals, and there would be this woman studying his car like it was evidence in a crime scene. The whole situation started affecting his sleep. Ryan had always been able to leave work stress at work, but now he was bringing home a different kind of stress. He found himself wondering what this HOA president was thinking, what she might be planning, and whether his peaceful, suburban dream was about to turn into a nightmare. He'd moved to Maple Ridge to escape conflict, but it seemed like conflict had found him anyway. And he had no idea that Margaret Henderson was already planning her first move in what would become the most expensive mistake of her 7-year reign as HOA president. Ryan just wanted to come home to a quiet house and relax. Instead, he was about to become the target of someone who had never learned the difference between keeping a neighborhood nice and keeping neighbors under control. Ryan had just finished a grueling 16-hour shift that ended with a drug bust gone wrong. 2 suspects had fled on foot through downtown, leading to a chase that lasted 3 hours and ended in a warehouse district at 2 a.m. By the time he got home to Maple Ridge Estates, Ryan was exhausted, hungry, and looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and his own bed. He parked the Explorer in his driveway like he had every day for the past week and trudged toward his front door, his police radio still crackling occasionally with late-night calls from across the city. All he wanted was to leave work behind and get some rest before his daughter Ashley came over for the weekend. That's when he saw it. A bright yellow piece of paper stuck under his front door, flapping slightly in the morning breeze. Ryan's heart sank. In his experience, yellow papers were never good news. They were usually citations, warnings, or notices about something you'd done wrong. He pulled the paper free and read it under his porch light. The header said, Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, violation notice, in bold, official-looking letters. Below that, someone had filled out a form with neat, precise handwriting. Violation of Section 412, Commercial and Non-Residential Vehicles, the notice read. Black Ford Explorer parked in driveway violates community covenant regarding commercial vehicles on residential property. Correction required within 14 days or further action will be taken. Ryan read the notice 3 times. Sure, he was missing something. His SUV was commercial. It looked exactly like thousands of other Ford Explorers driven by families all across America. There was nothing on the outside that identified it as a police vehicle. No logos, no special markings, no equipment visible from the street. He looked back at his driveway where the Explorer sat. In the dim streetlight, it looked like any other dark-colored SUV. He walked around it slowly, trying to see what this HOA president might be seeing. The only differences between his vehicle and a civilian version were completely internal. Better radio equipment, reinforced panels, and a few other modifications that weren't visible from the outside. Ryan felt his first flash of real anger. He'd spent 15 years putting his life on the line to keep communities safe, and now someone was treating his work vehicle like it was some kind of eyesore that didn't belong in a nice neighborhood. He'd been shot at, threatened, and spent countless nights away from his family to do a job that most people wouldn't even consider. And this was the thanks he got? But Ryan was also a professional. He'd learned long ago that losing your temper rarely solved anything. If this was just a misunderstanding, he could clear it up with a simple conversation. Maybe this Margaret Henderson person just didn't realize that his SUV was a personal vehicle that he happened to use for work. The next evening, Ryan decided to take a direct approach. He'd introduce himself to the HOA president, explain the situation, and hopefully put this whole thing to rest. He looked up Margaret's address in the neighborhood directory and walked the 3 blocks to her house. Margaret's house was exactly what Ryan expected. The lawn was perfectly manicured with edges so straight they looked like they'd been cut with a ruler. Every bush was trimmed to identical height. The driveway was spotless, and even the mailbox looked like it had been polished recently. A small sign by the front walkway read, HOA President in neat lettering. Ryan rang the doorbell and waited, making sure his badge was visible on his belt. He wanted to establish right away that he was a police officer, hoping that would clear up any confusion about his vehicle. Margaret opened the door after about 30 seconds. She was exactly what Ryan had pictured. A well-dressed woman in her 50s with short, neat hair and the kind of intense expression that suggested she took everything very seriously. She looked at Ryan with the wariness of someone who wasn't used to unexpected visitors. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked, not opening the door all the way. "Hi, I'm Ryan Torres. I just moved into the house on Oakwood Drive," Ryan said with his most professional smile. "I wanted to introduce myself and talk to you about the notice I received regarding my vehicle." Margaret's expression immediately hardened. "Oh, you're the one with the commercial vehicle in the driveway." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," Ryan said calmly. "I'm a police detective, and the vehicle you're referring to is my assigned patrol car. It's not a commercial vehicle in the traditional sense." "I don't care what your job is," Margaret replied, crossing her arms. "The rules apply to everyone equally in this community. That vehicle is clearly not a normal family car, and it violates our covenant." Ryan felt his patience starting to slip, but he kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson, my car looks exactly like any other Ford Explorer. There are no commercial markings on it, no business logos, nothing that would distinguish it from a vehicle owned by any other resident." "I've done my research, Mr. Torres," Margaret said, her tone becoming more confrontational. "I know you work in drug enforcement. That makes your vehicle a liability to our family-friendly community values. Parents don't want that kind of element in their neighborhood." Ryan couldn't believe what he was hearing. This woman was talking about him like he was some kind of criminal, instead of someone who spent his days arresting actual criminals. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm one of the good guys. I keep drugs off the streets and away from kids." "That may be what you claim," Margaret said, "but your presence here brings unwanted attention to our community. Drug dealers might follow you home. Criminals might target this neighborhood because they know you live here. Have you considered what that does to our property values?" Ryan stared at her in disbelief. In 15 years of police work, he'd dealt with murderers, drug dealers, and career criminals who had shown him more respect than this woman was showing him right now. People whose lives he'd literally saved had been more grateful than his own neighbor. "Mrs. Henderson, I chose to live here because I wanted a quiet, safe place to call home. I'm not bringing any danger to this community. If anything, having a police officer living in the neighborhood makes it safer for everyone." "That's not how I see it," Margaret replied firmly. "And frankly, the way you're trying to use your badge to intimidate me into ignoring the rules proves my point. You think being a police officer puts you above our community standards." Ryan felt his face getting hot. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was trying to have a reasonable conversation with a neighbor. But this woman seemed determined to see him as some kind of threat instead of someone who had dedicated his career to protecting people just like her. "I'm not trying to intimidate you," Ryan said, working hard to keep his voice calm. "I'm trying to explain that my vehicle doesn't violate your rules because it's not actually a commercial vehicle. It's a regular SUV that I happen to use for work." "It's a police car," Margaret said flatly. "That makes it commercial, and even if it wasn't, your attitude right now tells me everything I need to know about the kind of neighbor you're going to be." Ryan looked at this woman standing in her perfect doorway of her perfect house, treating him like he was some kind of criminal, and realized that no amount of reasonable discussion was going to change her mind. She'd already decided that he didn't belong in her neighborhood, and she was going to use whatever rules she could find to make his life difficult. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope you'll reconsider your position on this," Ryan said finally. "I'm just trying to be a good neighbor." "Being a good neighbor means following the rules that everyone else has to follow," Margaret replied. "No exceptions." Ryan walked back to his house. He felt a familiar weight in his chest that he usually only experienced after particularly bad days at work. He'd moved to Maple Ridge to escape stress and conflict, but somehow he'd landed right in the middle of both. He thought about all the times he'd been called to settle disputes between neighbors and how he'd always wondered why people couldn't just talk to each other like adults. Now he was starting to understand. Some people didn't want to find solutions. They wanted to win. Ryan had no idea that his polite attempt to resolve the situation had only convinced Margaret that she was dealing with someone who thought he was above the rules. In her mind, his badge and his calm demeanor were just evidence that he was trying to manipulate her. The battle lines had been drawn, and neither side fully understood what they were getting into. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She kept replaying the conversation with Detective Torres over and over in her mind, and each time it made her more angry. The man had stood on her doorstep, badge clearly visible, and tried to convince her that the rules didn't apply to him. In her 7 years as HOA president, no one had ever been so bold about trying to get special treatment. She sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a cup of tea and her laptop, researching everything she could find about police vehicles and HOA regulations. If this Torres fellow thought he could intimidate her with his badge and his calm professional tone, he was about to learn that Margaret Henderson didn't back down from anyone. The more she read, the more convinced she became that she was absolutely right. Police vehicles were clearly different from regular civilian cars. They had special equipment, reinforced panels, and were owned by government agencies rather than private individuals. How was that not commercial? And the fact that he worked in drug enforcement made it even worse. What if criminals followed him to the neighborhood? What if drug dealers started targeting Maple Ridge because they knew a narc lived there? Margaret had worked too hard building this community to let one person's selfish choices put everyone at risk. Property values in Maple Ridge had increased steadily under her leadership. The neighborhood had won awards for beautification. Real estate agents specifically mentioned the strong HOA when they brought clients through. She wasn't about to let some newcomer undo years of careful work. By morning, Margaret had a plan. If Detective Torres thought he could use his position to get around the rules, she would show him that in Maple Ridge Estates, the only authority that mattered was the HOA covenant. She'd done this before with other difficult residents, and it always worked. You just had to be firm and consistent. Her first call was to Janet, her friend who ran the HOA at Sunset Hills. Janet had dealt with similar situations and always had good advice about handling problem residents. "You were absolutely right to stand your ground," Janet told her over the phone. "The minute you make exceptions for one person, everyone else will want special treatment too. Before you know it, your whole neighborhood looks like a parking lot for work trucks and commercial vehicles." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Margaret agreed. "And the fact that he's a police officer makes it worse. He clearly thinks his job puts him above the rules that apply to everyone else." "Have you considered escalating to enforcement?" Janet asked. "Sometimes people don't take the rules seriously until there are real consequences." Margaret had been thinking the same thing. The HOA covenant gave her several options for dealing with violations. She could issue additional fines, take legal action, or in extreme cases, even have vehicles towed from the property. She'd never had to go that far before, but maybe it was time to send a strong message. Over the next few days, Margaret observed Detective Torres' schedule more carefully. His black Explorer was parked in the driveway for 3 or 4 days at a time, then gone for a day or two, then back again. She took photos every day, documenting the ongoing violation with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. She also started paying more attention to the other vehicles in the neighborhood, looking for any sign that standards were slipping. The Peterson family still hadn't fixed their garbage can situation. The Williams family's lawn was looking better, but they'd started parking their teenage son's car on the street instead of in the driveway. Margaret made notes about all of it. If people thought they could start bending the rules, she needed to remind everyone that she was watching. Margaret's research had led her to Suburban Towing, a company that specialized in HOA enforcement. Their website explained that they worked with homeowner associations throughout the region to remove vehicles that violated community covenants. They had experience dealing with all kinds of situations, from abandoned cars to commercial vehicles in residential areas. She called their office on a Thursday morning when Detective Torres's Explorer had been parked in his driveway for 3 straight days. This wasn't an impulsive decision. She'd been planning it for over a week, documenting everything, making sure she had solid grounds for enforcement action. Suburban Towing, this is Mike speaking, came the voice on the phone. Hello. This is Margaret Henderson, president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I need to arrange for the removal of a vehicle that's in violation of our community covenant. Okay, what kind of situation are we dealing with? Mike asked. We have a resident who's parking a commercial vehicle in his driveway, in violation of Section 412 of our covenant. The vehicle has been there for multiple days despite receiving proper notice of the violation. What type of commercial vehicle? Mike asked. Margaret hesitated for just a second. She knew the Explorer looked like a regular SUV, but she was confident in her interpretation of the rules. It's a police vehicle, a black Ford Explorer used for drug enforcement operations. Ma'am, are you sure about this? Mike sounded concerned. Police vehicles can be tricky. We'd need clear authorization that this is actually a violation. I am the HOA president, Margaret said with authority. I have full enforcement powers under our covenant. The resident has been properly notified and has refused to comply. The vehicle needs to be removed. Okay, but we'll need payment up front for police vehicle removals. There's usually more paperwork involved, and sometimes officers get upset about their cars being towed. That's fine, Margaret said. Bill my credit card directly. I want this handled as soon as possible. After giving Mike her credit card information and the address on Oakwood Drive, Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. She'd tried to handle this the nice way, but Detective Torres had made it clear that he wasn't going to follow the rules voluntarily. Sometimes you had to take decisive action to maintain community standards. Margaret spent the rest of the morning preparing her documentation. She printed out copies of all the photos she'd taken, organized her notes about the ongoing violation, and prepared a detailed report for the next HOA board meeting. This would be a perfect example of strong leadership and consistent enforcement. She also drafted a letter to send to all residents after the towing was complete. It would remind everyone about the vehicle policies and explain that the HOA was committed to enforcing all covenant violations equally, regardless of who the violator might be. No one was above the rules in Maple Ridge Estates. Around lunchtime, Margaret called Janet to update her on the plan. You're doing the right thing, Janet assured her. I had to have a contractor's truck towed last year when he kept parking it in his driveway overnight. The owner complained to the board, but in the end everyone supported the enforcement action. It actually made the neighborhood stronger because people saw that the rules applied to everyone. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, Margaret said. This Torres fellow thinks his badge makes him special, but he's about to learn that the HOA covenant is the only law that matters in this community. Margaret decided to be present when the towing happened. She wanted to make sure everything went smoothly, and she also wanted to document the enforcement action for her records. She planned to position herself on her front lawn, where she could observe and take photos while staying on her own property. The tow truck was scheduled to arrive the next morning at 10 a.m. when Detective Torres would most likely be at work. Margaret had specifically requested that timing to avoid any potential confrontation. This was about enforcing the rules, not about creating drama or conflict. As Margaret went to bed that night, she felt proud of her decisive action. 7 years of strong leadership had taught her that sometimes you had to make tough decisions for the good of the community. People might not always like her methods, but they couldn't argue with the results. Maple Ridge Estates was proof that consistent enforcement of reasonable rules created a better place for everyone to live. She had no idea that by tomorrow evening, Her perfect plan would result in her own arrest, the end of her HOA presidency, and a story that would be told in police stations across the city for years to come. Margaret Henderson was about to learn the hard way that there's a big difference between HOA authority and actual legal authority, and that some rules are a lot more serious than others. Tuesday morning started perfectly for Margaret. She woke at her usual 5:30 a.m., had her coffee, and reviewed her plan one more time. The tow truck was scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m., which would give her plenty of time to position herself on her front lawn with her phone ready to document the enforcement action. Detective Torres's black Explorer had been parked in his driveway for 3 straight days now, which made this a clear-cut case of ongoing violation. Margaret dressed carefully for the occasion. She wore her official HOA polo shirt and made sure her president badge was prominently displayed. This wasn't just about removing one vehicle. This was about establishing precedent and showing the entire community that rules meant something in Maple Ridge Estates. At 9:45 a.m., Margaret walked out to her front lawn and set up her folding chair, in the perfect spot. She had a clear view of the Torres house 3 blocks away, and she'd tested her phone camera to make sure she could get good photos from this distance. She brought a thermos of coffee and her clipboard with all the documentation she'd prepared over the past week. Right on schedule, the bright red suburban towing truck turned onto Oakwood Drive at exactly 10 a.m. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched it drive slowly toward Detective Torres's house. Everything was going according to plan, but what Margaret didn't know was that Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived next door to Detective Torres, had called the police department as soon as she saw the tow truck. Mrs. Chen had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, and she'd never seen anything like this before. She knew Ryan was a police officer, and something about this situation felt very wrong to her. "I think someone is trying to steal a police car," Mrs. Chen told the dispatcher, speaking quickly and quietly from behind her curtains. "There's a tow truck trying to take Detective Torres's vehicle, and he's not home." The dispatcher immediately recognized Ryan's name. He was well known and respected throughout the department. "Ma'am, are you sure about this? Detective Torres lives in your neighborhood?" "Yes, he just moved in last week. Very nice young man. But this tow truck just showed up and they're hooking up his car right now." Meanwhile, Ryan was sitting in a courtroom downtown, waiting to testify in a drug case that had taken 2 years to build. His phone was on silent mode, as required during court proceedings. He had no idea that his vehicle was currently being loaded onto a flatbed truck 3 miles away. The tow truck driver, a guy named Bobby who'd been doing this job for 8 years, was starting to feel uncomfortable about the whole situation. When he'd first seen the black Explorer, he'd noticed that it looked different from most civilian vehicles. The tires were heavier duty, and there were some subtle modifications that made him think it might be a police car. "Lady, are you absolutely sure about this?" Bobby called out to Margaret, who was now standing at the edge of her property, filming everything with her phone. "This looks like it might be an undercover police vehicle." "I am the president of this homeowners association," Margaret called back authoritatively. "That vehicle is in violation of our community covenant, and I have full authority to have it removed. You have your payment. Now please finish the job." Bobby shrugged and continued working. He'd been hired to do a job. The lady had paid with her credit card, and she seemed very confident about her authority. But he made a mental note to get out of there as quickly as possible once the car was loaded. At 10:15 a.m., Ryan's radio crackled to life during a court recess. "Detective Torres, are you aware that someone is attempting to tow your vehicle from your residence?" Ryan's blood ran cold. "What? No, I'm in court. What's going on?" "We received a call from a concerned citizen who thought your vehicle was being stolen. Units are responding now." Ryan asked the judge for an emergency recess and raced out of the courthouse. His mind was spinning as he drove toward home. Who would try to tow his car? Was this connected to one of his cases? Had someone figured out where he lived? By the time Ryan pulled into his neighborhood, the situation had escalated dramatically. 2 patrol cars were already on scene, their red and blue lights flashing. The tow truck was still there, with Ryan's Explorer halfway loaded onto the flatbed. And standing in the middle of it all was Margaret Henderson, still filming with her phone and arguing loudly with the officers. Ryan parked and walked over to where Officer Williams, a guy he'd worked with for 5 years, was trying to sort out the situation. "Ryan, thank goodness you're here," Williams said. "We've got a very confused situation. This lady says she ordered the tow because your car violates some kind of homeowners association rule." Ryan looked over at Margaret, who was now pointing her phone at him and speaking rapidly. "There he is. Officer, this man has been parking that commercial vehicle in violation of our community covenant for over a week. I followed proper procedures and issued a violation notice, but he refused to comply." "Ma'am," Officer Williams said patiently, "this is Detective Torres's assigned police vehicle. It's not commercial, and you can't just have police cars towed." "I don't care what kind of vehicle it is," Margaret replied firmly. "In this community, everyone follows the same rules. No one gets special treatment, not even police officers." Ryan stared at this woman in amazement. Even now, with 2 patrol cars on scene and officers explaining the situation to her, she still seemed to think she was in the right. "Mrs. Henderson, do you understand that what you just did is illegal?" "What I did was enforce the rules that govern this community," Margaret shot back. "You think your badge gives you the right to ignore our covenant, but you're wrong." That's when Officer Williams decided he'd heard enough. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempted theft of a motor vehicle and filing a false report." The change in Margaret's expression was instant. The confidence and authority drained from her face as she realized that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. I have authority here." "The only authority you have," Ryan said quietly, "is what's granted by your HOA documents, and those documents definitely don't give you the right to steal cars." As Officer Williams placed handcuffs on Margaret's wrists, she continued protesting. "This is ridiculous. I was enforcing legitimate community standards. You can't arrest someone for doing their job." "Your job doesn't include committing felonies," Williams replied as he led her toward his patrol car. By now, neighbors had started coming out of their houses to see what all the commotion was about. Margaret could see Mr. and Mrs. Peterson from down the street, the Williams family, and several others she'd cited over the years for various violations. They were all watching as she was loaded into the back of a police car on her own perfectly maintained lawn. Bobby, the tow truck driver, was just relieved to unhook Ryan's Explorer and get out of there. "I'm sorry about this, officer," he told Ryan. "The lady seemed so sure about her authority. I should have asked more questions." "Don't worry about it," Ryan said. "You were just doing what you were hired to do." As the patrol car carrying Margaret pulled away, Ryan looked around at his neighbors, who were still standing in their yards and driveways talking quietly among themselves. Mrs. Chen came over to apologize for not calling sooner, and several other neighbors introduced themselves and welcomed him to the community. "I'm sorry about all this drama," Ryan told them. "I just wanted a quiet place to live." "Trust me," said Mr. Peterson. "It's going to be a lot quieter around here now." The charges against Margaret were straightforward. Attempted theft of a motor vehicle, which was a felony, plus filing a false report and harassment. The prosecutor offered her a plea deal that would reduce the charges in exchange for community service and a substantial fine, which she eventually accepted. Margaret resigned from the HOA board 2 days later, citing irreconcilable differences with certain residents. The letter she sent to all homeowners blamed others for not supporting her efforts to maintain community standards, but most people saw right through it. The new HOA president was Mr. Peterson, who had been wanting someone to challenge Margaret's methods for years. His first act was to revise the vehicle policy, to clarify that personal vehicles used for work purposes were perfectly acceptable, as long as they weren't actual commercial trucks or work vans with business logos. Margaret moved out of Maple Ridge estate 6 months later. The story of her arrest became legendary not just in the neighborhood but throughout the local police department. Officers would tell new recruits about the HOA president who tried to tow a detective's car, usually as a cautionary tale about what happens when people forget the difference between community authority and actual legal authority. Ryan never filed a complaint against the HOA or took any legal action against Margaret personally. He figured the embarrassment and criminal charges were punishment enough. His daughter Ashley thought the whole story was hilarious and started calling his Explorer the famous car, whenever she visited. The neighborhood became a much more relaxed place after Margaret's departure. Property values continued to rise, but now it was because people actually wanted to live there, not because they were afraid of getting citations for minor violations. And Detective Torres finally got what he'd been looking for when he moved to Maple Ridge Estates, a quiet, peaceful neighborhood where he could come home after